Okay, so we'd like to open the floor to questions, so if all the other speakers could come up. And then you have several options. You can go to the microphones, and in addition, you can submit questions electronically by using the iPlanner app or by following the instructions in the front of your meeting program. And I saw that we had a couple already. So the first set are all these U.S. institutions. Can Canadian institutions apply? For the Conquer Cancer Foundation, we accept applications from anywhere in the world. So yeah, it's not just American institutions for the Conquer Cancer Foundations. I think for NIH, Susan, the majority are
U.S. institutions.
Yeah. And then also there was a question as to where we can get the PowerPoint presentations. So if you go to conquer.org and go to the Grants and Awards section under the applicant resources tab, we'll have all the presentations here. Plus, we also have a list of websites that you can go to search for international funding opportunities, as well as the NCI and us. Go ahead.
Hi, just two questions for Dr. Lim. Thank you for that nice talk. So are you eligible to apply for a K-08 if you're currently a resident but you have a institutional guarantee for a faculty position the following year? So you'd be applying as a resident, but the grant wouldn't start until you were a faculty member.
I think you can.
You can?
Yes.
And then, for example, if you were lucky enough to be awarded like a Young Investigators Award, an ASCO Young, would you list yourself as a PI in that award, though, or?
You can still eligible for a K-08.
No, but I was a little confused by the designation for the training grants, and you were saying you list your mentor as the PI?
Oh, for ASCO Young, YIA, yeah, you can put as a PI.
You would be the PI?
Yeah.
Okay.
Make sure that the timing is correct, because, sometimes reviewers start calculating how many years of research experience you have.
Okay.
So that's what.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I had a quick question. So a lot of the institutions have, so-called career development awards. You get the, let's say, benefactor funds, but they don't necessarily guarantee protected time or everything else that comes along with, let's say, a true career development award, whether it's from the societies or foundations. If you as an applicant have some of these benefactor awards, intramural funding, does that disqualify you from applying for like the Concur Career Development Awards as junior faculty?
Not for the Conquer Cancer.
Yeah, it is fine, as long as, yeah.
Thanks.
But you may not be able to hold two together. I mean, you have to give up one, but it's all depending on.
I have a question. Some of the MDs and MD PhDs have told me over the past 2 to 3 years that they're disinclined to apply for K99R00 during their residency/fellowship because they've been given the impression that that's mainly for pure PhDs. Is that, what's the intent and what is your thoughts?
No, we include, actually, we even encourage MD PhD to apply. The only thing is require full-time or 75% efforts. So that's, yeah. We do have a few MD PhD that are getting K99R00.
Another question, which study section does it go to? Is there still a manpower and training study section?
K99R00 and K22 is reviewed by NCI subcommittee.
Hi there. My name is Kara McDermott. I'm at the University of Washington and Fred Hutch, and some of the feedback I've gotten on grant applications is that I may be far enough along in my career to consider the R mechanism. And I'm wondering, given the feedback I've gotten so far on the K, what advice you have for an investigator who's in a position where they've gotten some feedback that maybe you don't need more mentored career development, but at the same time I don't feel like I'm ready to make the jump to an R01. How would you advise somebody in such a situation?
I mean, so I think more and more people are writing smaller, shorter R's, right? I think so, especially, some of the R21s are getting sort of faded out. So, but I think you're starting to see more, 3-year R01s, with the modular budget to sort of be that, and, that extra link, like as if you had a KROO.
I see.
I don't know if you've seen that.
Thanks.
Hi. Dr. Thomas, Professor Thomas, I'd just like to thank you for your talk on mentorship. That was really, really interesting. You talked about gendered language being used in mentorship letters. Do you correct for that when you are reviewing these, or do you expect that to be corrected at the institutional level?
The University of Arizona, if you can come up to me afterwards to search it, the University of Arizona had a nice primer for their faculty and staff on how to write letters and with respect to not compromising the female applicants that you're writing on behalf of. And there has been data with respect to NIH grants and other subcommittees that there can be a bias that creeps in the way the reviewers make their comments, the way they assess female applicants, and it's more paternalistic and so forth. So there are the University of Arizona website, I have to look it up, because we wrote a short letter to the editor with Dr. Jaxie in the International Journal of Radiation Oncology, Biology, and Physics. It's a short primer on how, as a letter writer, to start to correct for that. Now, does the study section notice? They may not. And so this is where we're trying to, ideally, one of the audiences that should be here are people who are actually writing the mentorship letters.
Yeah.
So, but it's up to you, in part, if you're aware of this, to, if you can have those communication channels.
Yeah, no, I
to
know.
try to educate them on that.
Yeah, I've corrected my letters, and I tend to ask them to use my initials rather than my name to try and take that into account, but I just wondered if it's discussed in your panel reviews of grants at all. No.
I haven't noticed that unless there's someone who's really in tune and will bring that up, but not commonly. At the last ASCO Grant Selection Committee meeting in February, there was no comment about that, at least in the grants that I didn't review as far as the mentorship letter.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much.
So we had one more via the web here. It asked if MD only, no PhDs are eligible for K99 awards.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I meant to say, I didn't mean MD, PhD, I meant just combine MD and PhD. All doctorate degrees can apply for a K99R00. And is there any grant good for clinical oncology fellows for only 1 year or 2, but not limitation about the postdoctoral degree training time? You want to?
That's what the YIA is all.
Yeah, that's basically what the YIA is, our Young Investigator Award. Any more questions? Right. Thank you very much. Oh, go ahead. How should a woman who has a child in fellowship or residency put that in the biosketch? So For us, we would give that as medical time off, so if that would not count towards your 10 years from MD to this. Yeah, you can just put it in your BioSketch. You can also send us a note or an email when submitting your application, and then we can be sure to note that in your application to ensure that you're not outside of the eligibility rules. And I think we've had conversations with other organizations, and they do much the same things in those instances. Any other questions? All right, I'd like to thank all of the speakers. We'll move on to the mock study session. So if we can have Wells and Gary and Dusty come on up. Can we get back to my presentations? There were 2 of them on there, and then I'll just use that next one on here. There we go. Oops. I'm sorry. I think I messed that up. Okay, so for the mock study session, what we'll do is I'll go over the criteria, and we actually do this in the selection meeting as well, where we'll go over with all the reviewers that gather in at the meeting. So we have an in-person meeting. For the Young Investigator Awards, we have approximately 55 reviewers and biostatisticians in the room, and for the Career Development Award, we have approximately 25 primary, secondary reviewers, biostatisticians, and patient advocate reviewers in the room. And so first of all, I'll go over the criteria like we do there. So the application that was handed out to you and that we will review was one that was not funded. You also have access to the same applicant who revised their application and was subsequently deemed fundable. So for the primary criteria for the Career Development Award, 35% of the scoring goes towards the potential for the applicant to pursue an academic clinical oncology career. And these are all found in the request for proposals as well. So, especially for the Conquer Cancer, it's important to look at these criteria to determine how you're going to be judged. 35% also goes to the strength of the hypothesis-driven proposal with a clinical research focus. So as we're a clinical oncology organization, it's imperative that your applications have a clinical research focus. The secondary criteria, 20%, goes to the strength of the mentor in supporting the applicant's proposal and in facilitating the applicant's career development. So under this comes the mentorship letter as well as other support letters. And then 10% goes to the availability of institutional resources to support the proposed project, which is 10%. And so that doesn't say that if you're at a large institution that you have an advantage. Does your institution have the facilities and the ability to support the application that you're presenting? So if the application that you give, if your institution has the appropriate facilities, then you're good. So the reviewers, like I had mentioned earlier, the Young Investigator Award has 3 reviewers, a primary and secondary scientific reviewer, both of which must write a full critique, and a biostatistician who also must write a full critique. In addition, the Career Development Award applicants are reviewed by a patient advocate reviewer, and they must write a full critique. And like I said, this is a career development award only. However, we're investigating new possibilities of how to incorporate patient advocate review into the Young Investigator Award. So just because we don't have a patient advocate reviewer for that doesn't mean that we're de-emphasizing the patient advocate perspective from the Young Investigator Award. It's very important, and we're moving more and more towards having that be an even more important aspect of the review. As was mentioned earlier in the session, we try to match the applications to reviewers that have an area of expertise in that field. However, it's not ideal sometimes, so the reviewer may not be an expert in your field. So be sure to be clear and concise and explain your science appropriately for someone that obviously has a solid, or is a solid scientist, but may not be in your field. And so that goes to the last point, where it's absolutely critical that that you explain the science clearly. Okay. And this should probably look somewhat familiar, as Susan had indicated the NIH criteria before. We go mostly by that. 1, 2, and 3 are high impact with an exceptional, outstanding, and excellent. The guidance that we give the reviewers for the high impact is that they're strong with weak to or negligible weaknesses, or no to negligible weaknesses. Moderate impact has strong, but is a strong application, but with some minor weaknesses. And then low impact has some strengths, but at least one major weakness. Okay, so at this point, I'll put on my GSC chair hat, and we'll begin a review of an application, basically just as we do it at a Career Development Award in-person meeting. So I'll have to go to the next page. There we go. So the applicant is Jane Doe from Organization X. The primary reviewer is Wells Messersmith. Secondary reviewer is Gary Schwartz. Biostats reviewer is Carla Ballman. And patient advocate is Dusty Dawson. So can I have everyone give their scores, and then we'll start with Wells. Give your score, original score, and then your critique.
Good. So my initial score is a 4.
Yeah, my initial score was also a 4.
Mine also was a 4.
And mine was a 2.
Okay,
so I'll provide an overview. So this application from Jane Doe, from a well-known academic medical institution, addresses the underlying biologic pathways responsible for de novo and acquired resistance to tyrosine kinase inhibitors in EGFR-mutated lung cancer. And I'm a GI oncologist, and sometimes you do review these things out of your field. So there's 2 specific aims. Specific aim 1 will analyze tumor biopsies from patients with advanced disease being treated with ruxolitinib using transcriptome, whole exome, IHC, and comparing to patient outcomes. And then specific 2 will use a window of opportunity preoperative design for newly diagnosed EGFR-mutated lung cancer, and patients will receive ruxolitinib prior to surgery with molecular analysis of the resected specimens. The applicant has preclinical data published in a top journal indicating that resistance may be mediated by NF-kappa B pathway, and you'll see if it can be used, or she'll see if it can be used as a biomarker to predict response, and we'll also use next-gen sequencing for additional mutations. Unfortunately, while the candidate and the environment are quite strong and the aims are well developed, enthusiasm is blunted by the cancellation of the entire program by the sponsor, which is, of course, out of the applicant's control, but there's no backup plan articulated in the application. Otherwise, my enthusiasm was relatively high based on the applicant's scientific approach and significance and impact. Just a little more background on the applicant. This person is an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine. She has 10 years of experience in the lab and obtained an MD PhD from UPenn and then was made assistant professor after fellowship. She has received multiple grants already and has 3 pilot grants from lung cancer advocacy groups, and as I mentioned, is published in top journals, including the Cell Reports manuscript. The mentor is an associate professor, also somewhat junior, but very well funded, and has a sizable lab with multiple high-impact papers. And the mentor's letter, I thought, was sufficiently detailed. The innovation is there due to the new novel pathway that was described, that was discovered by the applicant. The approach I basically described, I thought the environment was excellent, and there are multiple letters of collaboration and support from other people at the institution. So again, just to sum up, I thought a good application, very promising applicant. Some minor issues with the approach, but one of the biggest issues is that this trial can no longer be done, and there really isn't a backup plan that's articulated.
I agree with Dr. Smith in his assessment. This is really the type of application that we should support. This is an application by a junior faculty member who has discovered a new mechanism of resistance to EGF-targeted therapy through NF-kappa B REL-A. It is the example of benchtop to bedside translational medicine that ASCO tries to encourage and encourages our young investigators, whether senior fellows or junior faculty members, to consider in putting together ASCO awards, especially when there's a chance for clinical translation and using a novel discovery such as in this case of where we find that there's an NF-kappa signature that may be predictive of resistance to EGFR targeted therapy, which is clearly a major medical issue in clinical cancer today. So I think from a conceptual point of view, it really hits all the highlights of what we need to look at in terms of a highly fundable application for ASCO-YA, translating one's own preclinical discovery into cancer medicine. Now clearly not everybody could do that, and I think having even a senior mentor have that capability and using the senior mentor's preclinical discovery and working in parallel with them has the capability of having a highly favorable award. So from this award, it really achieves one of the high goals of an ASCO award, and the applicant should be rewarded and acknowledged for that. Unfortunately, the applicant hit a major stumbling block in that the drug that he proposed for this novel approach in discovery of translational medicine involved a drug that was, at the time of this application, unknowingly to this individual, was abandoned by the drug company. Talk about bad luck. The company is called Clovis. It had a very interesting drug. It didn't look very promising in studies, and the drug was abandoned by a pharmaceutical company. Unfortunately, you can't predict everything, and even your best foresight. And so this particular application, for this basic flaw, which is a fatal flaw, would make this basically an unfundable application. And there's no alternative by the applicant thinking, should this drug be withdrawn from drug discovery and drug development, what should that alternative approach be? However, one of the strengths of the application is the fact he does look at alternative approaches in terms of how to analyze some of the micromolecular signatures, such as the gene arrays. Should there be insufficient density? Should there be lack of information regarding the sequencing? How to approach it alternatively, and these alternative hypotheses and alternative approaches are embedded in this document and clearly raise the thought process, showing that this applicant has thought carefully about what are alternative strategies I would use to make this a strong application. And it really does come through, and not to compare to others, but unfortunately in other applications we do review, some of those alternative hypotheses and alternate approaches are missing, and it would detract from the grant, and this does raise the elevation of the grant. So if I had and the last point I think also is that I'm a little concerned about the biostats, but interesting to hear what the biostatistician says. Clearly 50 patients in one of the aims of the study. I'm not sure where those numbers came from, though there was a strong biostats section. I'm not sure how those numbers were derived. The applicant has a very strong support letter. That's a very important part of the ASCO application, and has a very strong support statement, and there's a mentoring plan. And that's something that we do look carefully for, not just what the applicant is doing, but what is the plan the mentor plans to bring as part of that application process. And that is also embedded in the applicant's award letter from the mentor who's supporting this application. So if it wasn't for the fact that we have lack of a drug, which is unfortunately a fatal flaw, this is an undoable application, the way it's written, despite the novelty inherent in it. This is the reason why my overall enthusiasm is tempered, and we gave it a 4. I'd probably more likely give it a 5, but frankly, it probably gets an 8 because you just can't do the application. But because of the overall creativity of the individual and the strength of the person and the mentor, I was willing to give it a mid-score of 4 to 5. Thank you.
Carla, biostats?
Yeah, so my review, not knowing the drug and the history behind it, and my score was just driven by the biostats. So there are some real strengths. The sample sizes are clearly stated and the rationales provided for what the specific sample sizes would deliver, meaning that there are well-reasoned power statements provided. The power appears reasonable in most cases. It is sort of small numbers, but they're looking for relatively big effect sizes, and I think that that is appropriate because in order for the biomarker to be of use, it really needs to be on target, and so you would expect to see big effect sizes. And all the proposed analyses are detailed and they're all appropriate. However, there were some considerations that dampened my enthusiasm. This study talks about having a biomarker for the drug, and it's the NF-kappa beta activity level. However, all patients that are in the analysis are treated with the drug. So at the end of the day, we will know there's an association of the biomarker with the outcome, but we won't know whether it's prognostic or whether it's predictive of patient benefit from the drug. So that did dampen my enthusiasm. Also, the proposed measure of the NF-kappa beta activation was derived just in cell lines and has never been tested. There's no preliminary data on how well it works in humans. So I have a bit of skepticism with respect to that. And also, they're measuring 38 genes, but they're taking a very simplistic approach by just sort of summing the scores from each of the 38 genes, and I think that's a bit too simplistic. Also, there's one place where she's overreaching in what the data can address. In 1B, they're testing for tumor genomic alterations in addition to the EGFR mutations. And the claim is that if there's additional tumor genomic alterations, it'll have worse prognosis. And then the claim is made that if this is found, then patients will benefit from rationally designed first-line treatment. But this grant's not looking at that, so that claim's a little bit out of scope, and a minor ding for that. Finally, in AIM-2, the grant says that the phase 2 clinical trial endpoint is pathologic response. However, in the letter from Chloris, it implies that the endpoint is progression-free survival. So a little bit of inconsistency there. Just a minor thing. I did not ding too much on that.
As a patient advocate, I was very impressed with this candidate for several reasons. The area of study, there's a great need for people in the lung cancer community to have other things coming down the pipeline when their EGFR or ALK positive treatment stops working, when they have resistance. And so that was very a hopeful study, and I was also unaware that initially that the drug was no longer available. But the candidate also had very impressive background. Originally started in breast cancer and then made the crossover to lung cancer and showed a lot of commitment to lung cancer and had secured grants from some very leading nonprofit organizations, Free to Breathe, Bonnie Dario Lung Cancer Foundation, and Lung Cancer Research Foundation. So I was very impressed with the candidate's credentials and would love to have seen this project or something similar move forward.
Okay. Any discussion amongst the four of you?
I think there tends to be less discussion when there's pretty much consensus.
Yeah.
So, in fact, if you're on a study section and people agree, the chair often says, "Can we keep this short so we don't?" So I think there's a lot of consensus here.
Yeah. So good applicant, good grant.
Fatal flaw.
Fatal flaw in the fact that the drug was dropped by the company. Maybe some minor biostatistical issues, but those were minor, but unfortunately, the drug was dropped by the company. So final scores then.
I would have to stay at a 4. Like I said, in some ways it's an 8 because it's not going to happen. But
Right.
there's every other part of the grant was strong enough that I would stay at a 4.
Yeah, I'll say it a 4. We want to encourage this applicant to come back in a year and hopefully find another drug, another company, address some of the biostatistical concerns. So I think a 4 would be a realistic score.
I would have come up based on sort of the applicant's strength and so forth, but given the fact that there was no alternative plan for if the drug wasn't going to be available and this won't happen, I'm going to stay at a 4 as well.
And I'm going to go down to a 3.
Okay, so then at this point, we just have everyone in the committee submit their scores. So that's basically the way one of these is run. This applicant actually did resubmit and was awarded the Career Development Award the next year. And I think they're still on, if I'm not mistaken. So, no, they were fundable. We didn't have enough funding, unfortunately, for that year, but it was fundable. So are there any questions on the process? You have any questions for any of the reviewers? Can we have you use the microphone? I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Ajay, oncology fellow from Roswell Park. My question is, do you guys sum up all the scores to come up with a final score, or a mean, or median?
We have the average scores of all of them. So all the reviewers will submit a score, and then we come with the average of that.
And typically, so there'll be a range on a panel, and then if you vote outside the range, so it's really important to realize that most people who are putting in scores haven't fully read your grant. And so if you have a reviewer 1 that really hates it and everyone else likes it, unfortunately reviewer 1's going to present your grant to the rest of the group, and if they have a very negative view, it's going to be hard for you to catch up no matter how much reviewer 2 liked it. But anyways, there'll be a range on the committee, and then if you vote outside the range, you're supposed to raise your hand and say, I had more enthusiasm than the 3s and the 4s. I think this person's awesome. I'm going to go better. And then someone else might raise their hand and say, I think it's so bad that they don't have a drug. I'm going to go worse. And you're allowed to do that. But this is where the stochastic nature of grant reviews, because reviewer 1 will really determine the tone of the discussion of your grant. And just by chance, you might get someone who loves it or doesn't like it or whatever. And so that's why you have to have thick skin and just be willing to put it in again. And sometimes you'll get lucky and sometimes you won't.
Thanks.
I should add, in the reapplication, this applicant did address all the concerns and did succeed in getting another drug, osimertinib, which is an approved drug now for the EGFR mutant situation, and did address all the biostatistical concerns. He shifted a little bit and looked at co-occurring genomic alterations in one of the aims, and also began to use novel technologies such as circulating cDNA as a way of detecting genomic alterations in the blood of patients with metastatic lung cancer, which in the year from the previous year had become more of a new diagnostic tool. So I think the reapplication, which we didn't discuss, really did address all the concerns and also incorporated the latest technology available in evaluating genomics status of patients with metastatic lung cancer. And also, as I said before, the key things of these applications is to put alternatives, because in this application, for example, when a biopsy you can't always get tissue biopsies, and couldn't you get the same information by circulating free DNA? And these alternatives really show a thoughtful process by the applicant, that you're thinking about alternatives, because not always your first approach can succeed, but maybe your second or third approach to the same problem can. So I would encourage applicants to think creatively about alternatives. It's often missing from application, and you think, well, there's no space left to hit that 6-page limit, and where am I going to put these other information? That means you probably put too much information above everything else. This important part shows the reviewer how thoughtful you are about the application of the process and technology you're applying. And also do not ignore the biostatistical concerns. The biostatistician carries a tremendous amount of weight, and of course they should, on any application. And if you ignore that, either as a preliminary application or in a subsequent application, I guarantee you will not be funded, because the biostatistical approaches are critical to the feasibility and to the outcome analysis of these programs. So don't ignore what the biostatistician says in your comments, or don't ignore that when you put your application together. I'd in fact encourage you to work with the biostatistician in the application process itself, not to make sure you incorporate that. I'll give you an anecdote. When I put my first R01 grant in years ago, I did not have a biostatistician in the study group, and it got severely rejected on this one point alone. You might have a discovery for cancer. If it doesn't have good biostats, it's not going to get funded.
The other thing to point out when you resubmit a grant is that you really don't want to be defensive about the comments. Sometimes people will say things that are factually completely incorrect, and there's part of you that just says that's a totally ignorant, stupid comment, and please do your work before you read another grant that I put all this time into. But that's not what you should say. So, have a glass of wine, and then just write a very measured response. And defensiveness and sort of accusing or anything is not going to help you. So thank you for your comments. This was made my grant much stronger. Here are my replies. And then finally, and I think anyone who does clinical research has had this experience where a drug dies. I try never to write a grant around a drug. It'd be better to call this EGFR inhibition against T970M to, and so that you show right away that you have a backup plan, because drugs come and go. You might get a letter from someone and then that person gets fired, and then people in pharma are changing all the time, right? So that person's not there anymore, and sometimes collaborators will come and go. So these things just happen in clinical research. So the more you write it, such that it's not built around one drug or one single thing, it's going to help you.
But this drug, just a historical New England Journal of Medicine paper, positive study. Who would have thought it would have failed, right? The problem is there was falsification of the data. So the company had to withdraw the paper. But no investigator would have ever thought about that. The response rate was well overstated. So all the data had to be withdrawn. And the investigator, of course, submitted this thinking it was going to be the next approved drug in lung cancer. And that data was, the company had to actually close down the company completely after the falsification of data was announced to the public.
So just along some of those lines, the Conquer Cancer does provide feedback on our applications, and we encourage you to reapply. When you do reapply, we have a one-page upload that you set aside for you to address the concerns and the comments of the previous year's reviewers. As far as this application that was reviewed here and the subsequent one that was fundable, you have access to both of those at our website. If you don't have them here, I think we ran out of copies, unfortunately. But you can go to our website and get both the funded and unfundable one. And now if you're applying for the Career Development Award for the Conquer Cancer Foundation, pay a lot of attention to the Patient Advocate Reviewer section, the Advancing Patient Focus Research. On our 25-member panel, 5 members are patient advocates. And so that perspective is heavily weighted in our scoring, and ASCO feels that that's very important.
If I might just add a comment about that. I mean, we hear a lot about, patient-focused research, but I'm really glad to see Conquer Cancer doing this, and I would encourage all of you to, in any other research, to, bring in an advocate, a survivor of that particular type of cancer. I think their voice is unique and really adds a good perspective.
Are there any other questions? Do you guys have any more comments? No?
I think we didn't talk about a lot about the mentor letter. I can reinforce how important the letter is, and having a plan by the mentor, because the committee wants to see that not just you writing a good grant, and doing good science, but there's a plan for training. Remember, this is a training grant, this one in particular. So the mentor's input into how he's going to train you, which is in these letters, Dr. Small's letter states that. Am I supposed to say that? The PI said that. So, oops. But he didn't put the application. So the point is, those mentoring is an important part of the process, and it should be clearly stated in the mentor letter. You don't have always control about that. It's hard to tell your mentor what to put in the letter, but remind him or her that should be part of that statement.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea to sit down with your mentor well ahead and discuss, what each organization has different criteria that they judge on, and discuss with your mentor those criteria and how you can work together to address those.
Yeah, I think also if there's a way for you to get a copy of someone's grant from your institution who applied before, if they're willing to share with you, that's super helpful. So you can see the whole packet and also see the comments and see a resubmission and see the comments or whatever. That's very, very helpful, and hopefully your institution will have some examples that they can provide.